You are now watching Zach Lesage, the best place to learn about competitive Pokemon TCG. Let's get it! Yo, what's poppin' peeps? Welcome back to the channel. Zach Lesage here. Today we're going to be covering over the top 10 best decks in format. We've had a little bit of a shakeup this week with decks entering into the top 10, decks exiting into the top 10. So we're going to find that out during this video. That being said, all the deck lists and reference videos are in the pinned comment below. Be sure to check that out, learn what's going on with those decks, etc. And we're going to go through every one of these decks and let you know exactly what's going on, why it's moving, all that good stuff. If you haven't already, give this video a thumbs up. It does boost the YouTube algorithm. Subscribe to the channel, and let's jump into our number 10 spot. Jumping into our number 10 spot, we have Gengar VMAX. Now, Gengar VMAX has dropped from number 5 to number 10, and it's chilling at 120 CP. To put it in perspective, number 11 last week was at 120 CP, so it's appropriately placed on this list, but Gengar lost a lot of its kind of footing, didn't really get too many placements in the past week. Now, this could be due to a lot of different things, whereas I think Gengar might have you might be trying to counter it, or I think it might just be due to Rapid Strike Urshifu MOLTRES and Rapid Strike Urshifu MELONY variants seeing a little bit more success in the metagame. I know that as someone who's been playing Gengar a lot, the fighting weakness is very glaring with this one, so it's not necessarily like a single strike Urshifu VMAX Umbreon deck where you can easily get around that weakness, although your Houndours are kind of a casualty. It is one of those things where as the metagame changes and new decks enter, there are quite a few fighting type decks that are seeing success, and it's also due to the popularity of Jolteon. Gengar VMAX is all about hitting as hard as possible with Fear and Panic and Gmax Swallow Up. You can power it up with Single Strike Roar and really just have a continuous attacker that's very powerful. So if you're a little bit newer to the game or you want to beat Mew, this is the deck for you. I do have a reference video and deck list in the pinned comment below. If you are looking to build any of these decks online, you go to PTCGO use code ZLesage5 to save 5% on your order. That's going to be in the description along with a lot of the other sponsored things. That's really where we're at. I think Gengar could really... I don't foresee it exiting out of the top 10. However, if players just decide to play other decks, that's one thing that we've noticed a lot. Like, a lot of decks are falling not because they are bad, or maybe they're not as well positioned as other decks. It's because they're not seeing as much play as other decks. So you got to keep that in mind when it comes to kind of thinking about the list. But I do think Gengar could bounce back in the format, especially if Mew's able to counter some of these Rapid Strike Urshifus or change their deck construction a little bit and stuff like that. So I think Gengar's probably going to stay within the lower half of the top 10, but it could spike as far as it did at number 5. It is a Mew metagame, so if Mew's weak to Dark, Gengar VMAX is always going to be relevant regardless of what anyone says. Hopping into our number 9 spot and going up from number 13 last week is Rapid Strike Urshifu VMAX with MELONY. So I covered this deck last week on the channel, and I mean, I think it's really good. Tord was the one who basically created this deck a few months ago, and it's since been popularized and kind of how do I put it? Kind of, it's simmered down into just like a straight up MELONY Rapid Strike instead of playing an additional water type attacker. I've seen SUICUNE builds, Vaporeon builds, Rapid Strike, Inteleon VMAX builds. With all of this, I think that this version that I've seen Cal Connor playing a lot recently has been seeing a lot of success, just because you're able to go Gmax Rapid Flow with Passimian, with a telescopic sights, and kind of do 180 like you just hit Mews for 180. So if you go first against the Mew matchup, you could actually knock out 2 Mews before they even get set up, and then follow that up with MELONY. And of course, if you're in the game where you're attacking against Genesects on the bench, you can hit those Genesects for 180 each, and then go Metacham 10-10 and really try to bring the game back from there. So I mean, there's a lot of cool things that you can do with this type of deck, and I think that Rapid Strike, this is the best way to play Rapid Strike Urshifu VMAX. I'll just go out there and say it. I think it's the best way to play Rapid Strike Urshifu VMAX is the MELONY version. Tord got it right. Tord always innovating on these decks and figuring out what makes decks work. That being said, this is not the best positioned version of Rapid Strike Urshifu VMAX. this deck quite often does lose to Mew. Regardless of the whole 180s to Mew, regardless of all that stuff, it is one of those decks that does struggle to make that happen. So regardless if you're able to go Melony, G-Max Rapid Flow every single turn, because that's the whole strategy of this deck here, backed with a quick shooting Inteleon, Shady Dealings, Drizzile, and an Octillery in there for good measure, this deck does not have the Galarian Moltres to do well against Mew and other Psychic type decks, because most Psychic type decks nowadays are weak to Dark. So that's one thing. I think that this deck is on the move up a little bit as our metagame changes. We can see that Jolteon over the past week has had a little bit of a spike in popularity and stuff like that. We do got to keep that in mind as we kind of experiment with the metagame and understand it. So this deck, 10 more CP than the Gengar deck. It did see a little bit of play. Again, any of these decks in the like 100-ish range could literally go up with one placement at any kind of tournament anywhere. So reasonably, I assume this deck is going to make it within the top 10. I think it's definitely a top 10 deck, but it could fall out of that relatively easily. But we'll see. I think the other thing that's hurting this deck, or maybe helping this deck, is that the Rapid Strike Urshifu Moltres is more popular right now. So no surprises, no nothing here, but it is one of those things that will definitely affect a deck, because players will just choose to play that version, or maybe they'll just choose to play this version. They're very interchangeable. So as we continue on with this metagame, Rapid Strike Urshifu VMAX, decently positioned, although this deck does pretty much fold to Mew. Hopping into our number 8 spot, and previously not making it anywhere within the top 20, we have DURALUDON VMAX. Now, I know as a content creator, a lot of peeps like DURALUDON VMAX. I don't know, like, I like DURALUDON VMAX, and maybe it's because of its Skyscraper ability, maybe because it's a dragon, half hotel skyscraper building. I mean, it's a cool looking Pokemon, especially the VMAX. It has some cool ability where you can stop your opponent's damage if they have a special energy attached to them. There's also an attack that goes through anything, and of course, if you put that on the back of a Turbo Zacian, the Zacian Zamazenta build that's seen success in multiple decks, whether it's ADP Zacian or Turbo Zacian Zamazenta or Luke Metal, I mean, you already have a winning formula. Now, this looks like a build that was built, I think the person who created it is Fry Guy, if I'm not mistaken, and Grant Manley was really the one that popularized it. Sometimes, if you're creating a deck, it's one of those things where if you're not necessarily the most popular player, or people might not necessarily look at your results, or it looks like a one-of thing. Grant won a 100+ person tournament with this deck. I believe this is currently Grant's exact list, and the deck is kind of some kind of mid-range attacking control deck. That's why you see Avery and Flannery and Crushing Hammers, and I mean, it's a pretty cool version. I think that this build overall, it feels very similar to Decidueye, whereas when Decidueye does very well, it's because Decidueye, no one was thinking about Decidueye. No one was prepared for Decidueye. Now that this deck is popping off, I can only see this deck, it might hit its peak and get more popular because there's going to be more players who discovered this deck, but I think the deck's going to dip off because it's not going to see as much success. Now, this might be the birth of a deck within the top 10. I mean, it's a very popular deck over the past week. That being said, it hasn't necessarily got the results of other decks in the same popularity range in the past week. So that tells me that players are understanding how to beat DURALUDON VMAX at this time. So, I think DURALUDON VMAX could pretty much go anywhere. It's really the type of deck that could. If players are able to counter it out of the metagame, I think that that's really where it's going to see a lack of success. However, in a couple weeks, if players are not preparing their decks to beat DURALUDON VMAX, or if they're taking Training Court out of Mew for whatever new stadium they want to put in there, Dynatree Hill out there somewhere being like, play me, play me. In all seriousness, I feel like DURALUDON VMAX could spike up in the future. So if you haven't already, I definitely recommend picking these cards up, because it is the type of deck that seems like it's that Decidueye-esque deck in our format that could really strike, and even in another format, I mean, it just seems very good. So never know where it's going to go. I think it might go up a little bit and then go quite down, but that's just my prediction. We'll see how that goes. Hopping into our number 7 spot is SUICUNE LUDICOLO. So this deck has fallen a spot, and I mean, if you look at the CP numbers, our CP numbers going up from number 10 have gone 120, 130, 160, now 180. So they're within like 10 to 20 apart from each other in general. So falling a spot literally means not too much. When our number 6 spot, just to put in a little bit of a you know, spice it up, it's at 190. So it literally could have been any placements because things are based off of 10, so one placement in general. That being said, SUICUNE LUDICOLO is a strong deck because you're able to use Blizzard Rondo, get that boost from Enthusiastic Dance for 100 damage, and hit some things for a knockout. The thing that is difficult about this deck is that decks such as Mew can just underbench and not really get knocked out, and even when you want to get those extra damage counters on there, quick shooting does not work against fusion strike energy, so it does struggle a little bit when it comes to those kind of decks. Now that being said, Jolteon being up there in the meta game and just some other matchups that might be a little bit difficult make this deck kind of lower top 10, even though it's usually really good at a beginning of a format. So right now we're kind of mirroring exactly what happened in our Evolving Skies format. This deck was literally one of the best 3 decks for a while, and it eventually fell in top 10 or top 5. And then it fell within the lower half of the top 10. I think that SUICUNE can very much do the same thing here, and it looks like we've already hit that point where it's just like, I don't think you necessarily beat Mew all the time. Mew has a bag of tricks that usually will find a way to win. Jolteon is really not a good matchup due to weakness. And then you think about other decks in the top that are just difficult to deal with in general, and maybe those Averys and DURALUDON and maybe the Rapid Strikes taking out every single Lotad and Sobble in sight are really what make this a difficult one. Do I think this deck is going to fall too much more? No, I think it's popular enough. I think enough players who play this deck all the time, and we're probably going to see it within the middle range between the top 5 and the top 10. So the 5, 6, 7, 8 kind of, or maybe the 6, 7, 8 of the list. I think that that's really where this deck is appropriately placed, and that's really where I foresee it. Again, SUICUNE hasn't really had too many changes in the past little bit. Gabriel Samato's kind of skeleton list that we all kind of based our lists off of is really the one that we're still playing to this day. There are players who are playing Karina's Focus in their list. Don't necessarily know how I feel about that, but maybe that's the secret sauce. I think it's one of those things where we look at maybe we look at different ways to relift this deck or reinvent this deck and see exactly what's going on before we let it slip anymore. Otherwise, I think it's just a discovered deck, and it's doing it pretty well overall. Hopping into our number 6 spot, and from number 7 last week, it moved up a spot. So I think this is really, beyond DURALUDON is really the deck that's kind of moving on up in the list, and really not that much. It was a difference of 10 CPs. Ice Rider CALYREX VMAX. So Ice Rider CALYREX VMAX is a neutral-ish deck because it can knock out most Pokemon with 2 shots, whether it's from Ride of the High King, plus a Max Lance, and this deck can stay relevant because of Crushing Hammer and Fan of Waves to kind of deal with all these energies or low energy counts that other decks are playing. I think that this type of strategy is pretty good, and we're going to see it in a few decks, or at least we see it in a lot of the decks within the top 20 that attempt to break the top 10. We've seen SUICUNE and Inteleon builds, and straight up Dragapult VMAX builds, and straight up Victini builds that are like, yeah, you want to know what? Let's add in Crushing Hammers, Fan of Waves. We're really going to try to go against these popular decks in the metagame and see how it works out. Right now, I think it does work out. So if you are looking to make kind of a footing in the metagame, Crushing Hammer and Fan of Waves, or Energy Denial in general, are really strong themes within decks that are moving on up. That being said, decks like Mew play only 6 energies, Jolteon plays only 7 energies, Single Strike only plays 8 energies. We're all under 10 energies in those top 3 to 5 decks. I think it's one of those things where Crushing Hammer and Fan of Waves do hit extra hard against those decks that play a low energy count. So this was one of my personal favorite decks. I think right now it's kind of faded out from being a solid counter to where his decks again have just grown in strength, and Meloetta is more than enough in Mew to really like kick this deck down a little bit. That's not to say that Ice Rider can't win against Mew or against the other top decks in the format, but as decks continuously grow on a week-by-week basis, I think that's where we're at right now, where Ice Rider is, there's a reason why it's no longer a top 4, top 5 deck, and then it's sliding down a little bit. Could jump up a little bit, but right now, again, it's very similar to the SUICUNE LUDICOLO, where I think it's in that 5, 6, 7-ish spot, and we'll have to see where next week brings us. Jumping into our number 5 spot and shooting all the way up from number 9 is Turbo ZACIAN. Now, Turbo ZACIAN's the type of deck where, how do I put it? I wouldn't expect it to break top 5 because I don't necessarily see it having a strong matchup against most decks within the top 5. I think this deck is relatively neutral and it's budget friendly. So to see it shoot up so much, there's something going on. Now, I think what I can do is basically credit Josh Sutherland's, basically the best player playing this deck, or the most successful player playing this deck, typically only plays this deck. Now, there's nothing wrong with that, and it's one of those things where Josh, being one of my closest friends in the community, I'm happy to see all of his success. And whether or not he's playing Zacian or Luke Metal or anything else like that, he seems to see success with pretty much any deck he plays, and he plays in a lot of events. So this might be the case of a one player or a very small group of players really pushing one deck to its absolute most. I think what Josh is doing is outperforming Turbo Zacian in terms of the metagame. And that's, I think, if anything, I truly mean that as a compliment. It's one of those things where I think Turbo Zacian has its limitation. Josh has cranked those out there as much as possible and has shot it as far as number 5, almost putting the deck on his back, being the strong player he is, and carrying it from number 9 to number 5. That being said, as long as Josh is playing, we can't really accurately predict where this deck is going to go, whether or not he wins a late night series or a GG tour or something like that, which he has been known to win these events and these in real life events. I really think that these types of decks, it could really go anywhere. If you're new to the game or if you're looking for a budget deck, Turbo Zacian is really where it's at. They're not really expensive in real life or online, and the rest is really just trainer cards that have really gone down to the trainer kits and all of these all the other ways to acquire trainers lately. So I think that this is the type of deck that if you're new to the game, it's a great deck to play. I do have the posted lists in the pinned comments with a reference video as well that shows you how to play this deck. So it'd be great for someone who's looking to get into Pokemon, who doesn't want to drop a couple $100 on Mew VMAX. I think it's a strong choice, and like I said, as long as Josh plays this deck, really, however Josh feels is the limit of this deck. And if Josh decides to pick something else, I could see this deck falling off the top 10 entirely, dipping into the top 20. That being said, on a personal note, I do think this deck is probably within the lower half of the top 10, normally as we saw at number 9 last week. So depending on the week, I think that's probably where it's appropriately placed. I wouldn't put it below top 15, but it's just probably anywhere between the 8, 9, 10, 11, 12 spots if you're looking for something more of my opinion. Hopping into our number 4 spot, and also from number 4 last week, we do see Rapid Strike Urshifu for the second time this list, but this time with Galarian Moltres V. So kind of as I was alluding to, is that Galarian Moltres V is what makes this deck have a chance against Mew. Of course, if you hit a Jolteon deck, which has been getting a lot of popularity lately, we do have a fighting type attacker, and you have a dark type attacker against Mew. This deck, on top of having Gmax Rapid Flow to kind of take care of all the Sobbles and the Lotads and Houndours on the bench, really does hold its own against the metagame. Now, that being said, this deck I find plays out as if you sandwiched a Rapid Strike deck with an Inteleon deck, with a Galarian Moltres deck, whereas it doesn't feel like it's a cohesive mix. It feels like it's sometimes a little bit grindy or a little bit chalky. Something's off with this deck is the way that I'd put it. There's nothing wrong with this deck. This deck is one of the best decks in the format, but it feels almost inconsistent the way it sets up, and I almost want to say it's like Sylveon VMAX, where it's like Sylveon VMAX has Rapid Strike, and it has access to Blaziken, and it has Moltres or Leafeon, and it has Octillery, and it's just like, at what point do we go too far with a deck? I feel like this deck's that breaking point right before it becomes an inconsistent mess. And maybe that's the way that I'm feeling it. Now, that being said, I have won a decent bit of games with this deck in my testing, and I do truly give this deck my stamp of approval. I'm just kind of venting my thoughts out about how this is. There are other versions of this deck that are not playing Inteleon. It looks like they're based off of JW Flex Daddy's kind of early build of the deck with Galarian Articuno and Rotom Phones and stuff like that. I think that this version has been much more successful in the metagame, so I do want to keep that in mind as we explore through this metagame, that I'm going to go and post the most successful version of a deck or the more popularized version of a deck before posting just different variants and stuff like that. So this might change in the future, but right now I think that this is the way to play the deck. Again, it stayed within the top 4. Actually, all decks within the top 4 have stayed within the top 4. So I think we're now at that solidified point in the metagame where we have these top 4. I say this if this deck was 4 last week, it seems like it's going to probably stay within the top 4, top 5 this upcoming week as well. So keep that in mind. So jumping into our number 3 spot and falling 1 spot last week from number 2, we have Single Strike Urshifu VMAX. Now, Single Strike Urshifu VMAX is a very powerful deck where you're able to split between being an Umbreon V, Single Strike Urshifu V, Umbreon VMAX, and Umbreon VMAX type deck. So very similar to the Rapid Strike Urshifu Moltres. You are 2 types of a deck. You are fighting and you are dark. The only difference between this deck and that deck that makes it a little bit more solidified together or more cohesive is the deck is a single strike deck, so you could power it up with single strike energies to either one of those Pokemon to power it up. So you're able to have the dark type Pokemon against Mew, you're able to have a fighting type Pokemon against Jolteon and other fighting weak Pokemon, and of course you are all single strike themed. So I think this is really where this deck does very well. This is my most updated version of the deck. I'm looking to cover this deck again soon because I know a lot of people love the single strike Urshifu or just Urshifu in general. This deck's been absolutely killing it. I think that this is the true version of neutral in the format. I've brought that up a few times, whereas I think SUICUNE LUDICOLO is neutral, I think Ice Rider is neutral. This deck really holds its own against a lot of decks in the formats, where it can beat the Mews, it can beat the Jolteons, it does well against itself, it can hold its own against Rapid Strike. The thing where this deck struggles is sometimes inconsistency issues like any other deck, but beyond that, you're not going to really run into too many matchups, even single prize card decks, and be like, oh yeah, you wonder why I lose this game because of this. This deck has ways to go through anything, like DURALUDON with your GMAX Rapid Flow. You have ways to go through other decks, and I mean, even the sneaky... blah blah, it's Monday, peeps, give me a break. Single Strike Scroll of Scorn, that one's a tongue twister. If anyone wants to wake their morning up, try to say that card 5 times fast, and trust me, it's a toughie. Cool little sneaky techs like that work out. The Zinnia's Resolve really has been working out. You can see that this deck has been able to evolve, it's able to adapt to the metagame, and I think that's what makes it so strong, is that it can hold its own, change its construction. I've seen lists with 3-2 Umbreon or Single Strike VMAX and 2-2 Umbreon VMAX. Like, you could change your construction of this deck. You could even add Gengar in there. You could add, I've seen players play the single prize card Morpeko in this deck. There's ways to make this deck work against any particular metagame, and I think that's what makes the single strike archetype so strong. Hopping into our number 2 runner-up spot and moving up from number 3 last week is Jolteon VMAX. So if you've been paying attention to the CPs, you can see that Rapid Strike Urshifu Moltres was at 290, Single Strike jumped a full 200 points above that at 490. This just hopped up by 10 CP. So you can see between the 2 and 3 of Single Strike, they're hovering back and forth depending on the popularity. Now, I think Jolteon VMAX might be a little bit more popular, successful than Single Strike Urshifu VMAX, based off the amount of play that it's seeing, whereas Jolteon's actually seeing less play and more success, so that's usually the indicator of a very powerful dex. Max Thunder Rumble is really all about putting 100 damage on the active and 100 damage to a Pokemon that you hit with a Headbutt Tantrum with ZigZagoon or Quick Shooting with Inteleon. Since adding in a Fan of Waves to this deck and Path to the Peak, the deck can hold its own against decks such as Mew and other decks that are very ability based. There's not too many Path to the Peak decks that we've seen within our top 10. I think this is actually our first one. It's really the one that does Path to the Peak the best at this point. And if you're doing Path to the Peak Not a lot of decks are countering Path to the Peaks. Mew's actually going from 4-5 stadiums to 2-3 stadiums, and I've even seen talks of some Mew lists cutting their stadiums because it just doesn't matter anymore. They're like, oh, I'll take the loss of Jolteon. Well, if you're Jolteon, it's certainly nice to take a free dub here and there, and of course with SUICUNE Ludicolos and other popular decks, you can take those free dubs. There's not too many decks that just counter Jolteon VMAX. Of course, Single Strike Urshifu being part fighting deck can be a little bit tough to swallow, and the fact that there's 2 Rapid Strike Urshifu decks within the top 10 is a little bit difficult to deal with, but once you get past that, Jolteon has a high win rate and it's a very successful deck. My friend and teammate and testing partner Vaughn O'Brien was able to win the Connecticut 2.5k event with this deck as well, really proving that it's successful online, in real life. It's really just successful, and I think it's going to stay within the top 5 as we've seen with Rapid Strike and up. It's really like, if our top 4 hasn't changed, and you can see how these CP numbers are going, this deck's probably going to stay within the top 3. So if you haven't tried out Jolteon VMAX, it might be worthwhile for you to try out, because this deck is really the real deal. And of course, we just got those new alt art Jolteon Vs, you can see in the far left, and VMAXs that are releasing. Check your store if you haven't got a chance to. But they're going to be available on PTCGO already, if not very soon. And you can use code Lesage5 to save 5% on those, because those cards look absolutely sick. Whether you're a player or collector, we got to appreciate when a card looks amazing. Jumping into our number 1 spot, and previously at number 1 last week, is Mew VMAX. Now, Mew VMAX has been everywhere. It's not really budging, and you can see it has over 3 times as many points as Jolteon in second place. Like, it literally has number 10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, and probably 3. Like, it probably takes the entire list of the entire top 10, and that's pretty accurate to what Mew is. So that just shows really how strong Mew is. Now, we'll kind of make this section a little bit interesting. This is my ideal version of Mew for this current metagame. Whether or not your list is a couple cards different or not, probably won't matter. If you hit hard with Mew, you're going to be doing Mew things. That being said, a lot of players are asking, should Mew VMAX be banned? Do I think Mew VMAX should be banned? Well, you want to know what? If it was, if there were standard regionals and other official TPCI major events, I think that Mew VMAX would likely get banned. I would hope so, at least, because it seems like it's taking away a lot of creativity. Now, that's not to say that Mew VMAX is too powerful or anything else like that. I think there's definitely ways to counter it, like Jolteon's finding ways to counter it, and other decks are trying to counter it, but the mass success of a deck like this does take away a lot of aspects of skill from the game in general. And I mean, if you're a player who's looking to do well, I recommend picking up Mew VMAX cards. I've currently decided that I am not going to be banning it from online events, and the reason why I'm personally not banning it from online events, because a lot of people look up to me and they're like, yo, you want to what, Zach? You run the biggest tournaments in the game, in real life or online right now. No one's running a bigger event than the 350-ish Fusion Strike era events that I'm running at the Late Night Series. That's not me looking for any kind of whatever pat on the back. I'm just trying to say, like, as someone who's running these events, I do think about these things very clearly. I think it'd be disingenuous for me to ban Mew, because if someone watched these videos and was like, yo, Zach says Mew's #1 every single week, which it is, it's the #1 performing deck, I'm going to use code ZLESAGE5 at PTCGO pick up Mews, and then if I ban them, I literally just wasted someone's $250 or $200 or however much Mew costs, and I don't want to take away anyone from playing the game. The same way that when we had ADP-zation as a big deal in the format, and there was the ADP-zation League Battle decks, when players ban those cards from a tournament, you are banning an accessible deck for someone who's might have picked that up or got it as a gift, and then they are not able to play in a tournament with that same deck. I don't want to do that to anyone. I want to make it sure that everyone has accessibility to play. I understand that Mew is difficult to acquire for some. That being said, if you're trying to do that, counter Mew. A lot of the decks that counter Mew are very basic, or very or are a little bit cheaper than Mew. Put it like that. If you need any help with that, by all means, join the Discord server. We could spark a discussion, or let me know in the comments below. basically my end of the rant is I'm not banning Mew VMAX. Mew VMAX is incredibly powerful. It's it's the real deal. If you're playing in any tournament, Mew VMAX should always be a deck that you have in your account, a deck that you should have in your back pocket, a deck that you should have in your bag, whatever. That's where it's at. The only other thing that I want to bring up before we go, because these rants can go a little bit long. Last week, Mew had around 1700 CP, and right now it has 1660 CP. I do want to point out that the amount of tournaments weekly on Limitless does change, and the amount of players playing on Limitless weekly does change. So keep that in mind, that these CP fluctuations are also affected by that. So if you're like, oh, last week it was almost near 1800, yeah, it was. But that was just because there was more tournaments and more Mew seeing success. So I really look at the placement first, and then look for credibility within the CP of that. So the fact that this is 3 times as much as number 2 shows you really how strong this particular deck is. Well, that's what we got going on for this video today, peeps. Hopefully you enjoyed looking through the top 10. I do want to let everyone know that either tomorrow or within the next day or so, that I will be having the decks number 11 through 20 as well. If anyone's interested in those to see what's on there, we got a lot of spicy decks on that list that made it this week. So the metagame's changing overall. The top 10 did have Duraludon. It's really been crashing the party at a lot of places. It's a really cool deck, and I hope that everyone enjoys these top 10 deck videos. I love making them. They take the most time out of any other video in my week, but I really hope that you appreciate the love, passion, and everything else that I pour into the content. Again, if you haven't already, give this video a thumbs up. It does really help boost the YouTube's algorithm. That's just a little like button right there. I know my mic's covering it, but if you click the like button, it really does help. Maybe sharing this with a friend, or sharing it on Twitter or something else like that. That would really be helpful. Leaving a comment below, really helpful. Subscribing to the channel, double check. I know there's a lot of channels that I look to and I'm like, wait, was I not subbed to this account? Wow, that was so I do that all the time. So if you haven't got a chance to check that out, by all means check that out. Again, I appreciate all the love and support lately. We're so close to 8,000 subs. It's been absolutely amazing, and I can't wait to make more content for everyone else. That being said, I gotta edit this video, and it's still Monday morning, so we're gonna get this video out today. I'll catch up with all y'all later. Peace out and have a great one. I truly appreciate you taking the time out of your day to watch this video. It means the world to me. And my goal with this channel is to spread my love of the game and knowledge with our entire Pokemon TCG community. If you haven't already, help signal boost this video to other Pokemon TCG fans by liking it, sharing it with your friends, and subscribing to the channel. Hopefully we reach our goals really soon. Check out this recommended video and have yourself a great day. Thanks.